Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Chioma stood at Adi's doorstep with a smile on her face and a cake in her hand. It wasn't anything extravagant, just her signature vanilla sponge layered with love, the same recipe their late mother used to make for them as girls. Wrapped beside it was a small gift, a modest gold bracelet with "To my Ada forever" engraved on it. She had stayed up the night before cooking Adi's favorite egusi soup and jollof rice. Today wasn't just her sister's birthday. It was a reminder of the unbreakable bond they'd always shared. Adi's had no idea she was coming. Chioma wanted it to be a sweet surprise. She juggled the food basket, the cake box, and her purse as she knocked. When no one answered, she tried the knob. It turned. The first thing she heard was the sound of a shower running. Chioma stepped in with a grin, ready to yell surprise. She walked through the small living room and into the hallway, thinking maybe Adi's had left the bathroom door open. But when the bathroom door creaked open and a man stepped out with a towel around his waist, Chioma's breath caught midair. It was Ibuka, her husband, wet, shirtless, and freshly out of a shower, in her sister's apartment. He froze when he saw her. The towel slipped slightly, and he grabbed it tighter. A silence like death dropped into the room. Behind him, Adi's emerged in an oversized t-shirt, hair still damp, face void of any excuse. Her eyes met Chioma's, then darted away. That moment, time shattered. Chioma didn't say a word. Her fingers slowly let go of the cake box. It crashed to the floor, cream smearing across the rug like spilled blood. She stared at the two people who meant the most to her, her husband of 6 years and the sister she raised like her own child. The same Adi's she once shared beds with when their parents died. The same girl she housed, fed, and encouraged when things got hard. Ibuka tried to speak. "Chioma, it's not what you think," but his voice sounded far away. Adi's reached out as if to touch her hand, but Chioma took a step back. She felt the world spin, as if her soul had left her body to hover above the ruin below. She turned around, walked out, and closed the door behind her. Her footsteps felt heavy, her breath shallow. That day, the sun seemed to dim. Back at home that evening, Chioma sat on the edge of the bed like a statue. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the mattress, knuckles white, heart thundering in her chest. Ibuka had returned hours later, wearing a straight face as if nothing had happened. He dropped his keys on the table, glanced at her, and walked into the kitchen like a man coming home from work. No apology, no shame, just audacity. Eventually, he returned with a bottle of water and casually said, "I was helping Adi's fix her bathroom heater. I didn't expect you to show up." Chioma blinked slowly. That's all he had to say? A lifetime of trust, reduced to a plumber's errand wrapped in a towel? Adi's had sent a text earlier. "Please don't misinterpret what you saw. Ibuka only came to help me. I was sick, and he came through for me. I'm sorry if it looked wrong." Chioma didn't reply. She didn't have the energy. That night, as Ibuka slept soundly beside her, she stared at the ceiling with swollen eyes, questions piercing her mind like needles. Was this the first time? How long had they been sneaking around? And worst of all, why did neither of them look surprised? It wasn't guilt she saw in their eyes that day, it was panic. Panic that they'd been caught. There was a difference, and Chioma knew it. She felt like a stranger in her own marriage, in her own skin, in her own bed. Her chest rose and fell with silent sobs as Ibuka snored beside her. She buried her face into her pillow and let the grief come, wave after wave. There were no screams, no shouts, no punches to the wall. Just quiet pain, the kind that eats away at the bones. That night, a shift happened within her. A seed was planted, not one of revenge, but of awakening. She realized that neither love nor loyalty had protected her from betrayal. Only silence had. And so, she chose it. Chioma said nothing. No confrontation. No fight. Not yet. But inside her, something stronger than anger was rising, clarity. And it would soon show its face. The next few weeks passed like a fog. Chioma played the role of a loyal, composed wife. She woke early, cooked, cleaned, and kept up appearances. But beneath her quiet gaze, her mind was wide awake. Her instincts sharpened. She started observing everything more closely. How Ibuka always claimed there was no money to pay bills, yet never failed to upgrade his phone. How Adiz now flaunted new designer bags on Instagram, even though she had no job. One day, while Ibuka was in the shower, his phone buzzed beside her. Normally, Chioma respected his privacy. But this time, something stronger than fear moved her. She picked it up, and what she saw crushed the last piece of hope she was holding on to. A bank notification. 800,000 Nigerian nairas transferred to Adizu. Chioma felt her breath catch. She scrolled further. 250,000 Nigerian nairas. Nigerian naira 500,000 transfers from months ago. Some labeled for rent. Others just read heart. Her fingers trembled as she read through the history. She nearly dropped the phone. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a sustained betrayal. Her husband, who had once shouted at her for asking 5,000 Nigerian nairas to fix the kitchen sink, was sponsoring her sister like a private investor. The man who said they needed to cut costs was funding Adiz's trips, wigs, and lifestyle. And he did it without guilt. That realization burned like acid in her throat. She put the phone back and sat still for a long while. When Ibuka came out and kissed her forehead, saying, "Thanks for dinner," she didn't flinch. She simply nodded. But inside, she felt the walls of her heart start to fold in. This wasn't just infidelity, it was manipulation. He had made her feel guilty for asking for things, called her too dependent, made her believe she was draining him, while spoiling her sister behind her back. Chioma knew she had two choices: confront them and explode, or protect her peace and plan her way out. She chose the latter. That night, she opened a secret savings account. It was time to save herself. Chioma didn't throw a tantrum. She didn't scream or demand explanations. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She listened and observed. She watched the man she once called her partner wake up each morning, brush past her without a single glance, and complain about the rising cost of things while transferring thousands to Adiz. He sat on the couch like a king, remote in hand, barking at her about dinner while wearing a new wristwatch she didn't remember buying. She pretended not to notice when he hit his phone screen as she approached, and she didn't react when he started coming home later than usual. It was in the silence that Chioma found her strength. Every insult he hurled, every condescending tone, every reminder of how she would be nothing without him. She quietly filed them away, not as wounds, but as proof. Proof that the man beside her had long left the marriage. Only his body remained. Beneath the surface of her composure, Chioma began preparing her escape. From her modest catering hustle, small events, birthday parties, and weekend food trays, she began saving aggressively. She reached out to a former client, a soft-spoken woman who once encouraged her to scale up her service. The woman connected her to 3 more clients, and soon Chioma was making enough to stash away little by little. She opened a secret account using her maiden name, away from Ibuka's eyes. She made no noise about her growth, no declarations, no celebratory selfies. Her victory was in the shadows. She began building herself from the ashes of betrayal, brick by quiet brick. Every deposit felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, her dignity, her voice, her power. She used to believe Ibuka's words, that she'd collapse without him. Now she realized the only thing that ever held her back was her loyalty to a man who never deserved it. Still, the house remained a battlefield of unsaid words. Ibuka began noticing the shift. She didn't nag anymore. She didn't argue. She simply stopped reacting. That scared him more than any confrontation would have. He would say something deliberately provoking, and Chioma would just look at him with empty eyes, nod, and continue with her chores. He began insulting her cooking, saying she wasn't as exciting as she used to be. She didn't flinch. When he came home smelling of perfume and cheap alcohol, she simply offered him water and went to bed early. It was driving him mad. He needed her to react, to shout, to beg, to fight. But Chioma had learned that sometimes silence could cut deeper than noise. She was no longer the woman seeking his approval. She was a woman preparing for freedom. A quiet war had begun, and Chioma had mastered the art of bleeding with grace. One night, Chioma tried, one last time, to see if anything was salvageable. It was a soft, vulnerable moment. She had returned from a long day, her body aching, her spirit worn. She had just received a call from a potential client who promised to recommend her catering business to a hotel. It was the first time in months that something good had happened, and instinctively, she wanted to share it with Ibuka. She brought him a warm meal, knelt beside him on the couch, and told him the news. He barely looked at her. Then she reached out, placed a hand gently on his thigh, and said, "Ibuka, I miss us." He looked at her hand like it was dirt. Without a word, he stood, walked into the bedroom, and slammed the door. Later that night, when she approached him again in bed, he shoved her away and said coldly, "I'm tired. You're always so clingy." That rejection didn't just hurt, it confirmed what she already suspected. There was no us anymore. It wasn't about stress. It wasn't about tiredness. Ibuka had moved on emotionally, sexually, mentally. And worst of all, he had the audacity to make her feel like she was the problem. He hadn't touched her in nearly a year. He had weaponized intimacy as punishment, making her believe that her worth was shrinking because of her flaws. Meanwhile, he was spreading affection like confetti to others, including her sister. Chioma sat on the bathroom floor that night, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She whispered, "Maybe I'm not beautiful enough. Maybe I talk too much. Maybe I'm not enough." And then she caught herself, mid-tear. No, this was not her fault. Love was never meant to be earned with suffering. She was not the problem. She was just the only one still trying. The next morning, Chioma woke up differently. She didn't feel pain. She felt done. Done trying to fix what Ibuka had already thrown away. Done breaking herself into smaller pieces to fit into his ever-shrinking box of expectations. She made breakfast, served him as usual, and received no thank you. But this time, it didn't hurt. She ate in the kitchen by herself, and, in her heart, she told herself the truth. You are already alone in this marriage. Stop pretending otherwise. From that day forward, she no longer sought his validation. She stopped waiting for his attention, stopped begging for his touch. She began to pour her energy into her business, into her small savings, into her future. Because if Ibuka didn't want her as a woman, then he would soon see her rise as a force. Chioma's friend Amaka sent her a photo one evening. It was meant to be innocent, a casual beach selfie from a recent trip. But in the background of that photo, just barely visible, was a man lying on a lounge chair. The side of his face, the curve of his beard, the tattoo on his shoulder. It was unmistakable. It was Ibuka. And next to him, sipping a cocktail, was Adiz. Her legs crossed, laughing, sunglasses on. The sight hit Chioma like cold water. She stared at the image for hours, zooming in, trying to convince herself it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down she knew. There was no excuse this time. No gym heater. No sick sister. They were on a weekend getaway, and they weren't hiding it from the world. Only from her. What pained Chioma the most wasn't even the act. It was the betrayal of trust. She had once defended Adiz before their family, insisting she was just misunderstood, a little wild, but loyal. She was the one who pushed Ibuka to help Adiz get on her feet. She had even loaned Adiz money when she was jobless, fed her, clothed her, prayed for her. And this was her reward. Adiz hadn't just stolen her man, she had stolen her sisterhood. Chioma replayed every moment of trust, the shared childhood, the late-night conversations, the tears they wiped from each other's faces. All of it now felt like a lie. The photo became her turning point. That was the day her grief curdled into resolve. No more protecting their image. No more pretending everything was okay. The truth was ugly, and Chioma was finally ready to let it show. She printed the photo and placed it inside her Bible, not for spiritual warfare, but as a reminder of what betrayal truly looked like. She didn't confront Adiz. She didn't even show Ibuka. She didn't need to. She had already begun to outgrow them both. From that moment, she turned her heartbreak into focus. She accepted more catering jobs, enrolled in a short business course for food vendors, and started showing up where she was once afraid to be seen. She began to grow. People started noticing her. She bought her own used delivery bike for 120,000 Nigerian nairas and hired a boy to assist her on weekends. Slowly, the pain became fuel. While Ibuka and Adiz chased thrills, Chioma was building an empire, stone by stone, all on her own. Chioma stood by the food tray at her father's 65th birthday party, carefully arranging dishes and exchanging polite smiles with relatives who still viewed her as the lucky wife of Ibuka, the successful businessman. She wore a simple but elegant Ankara gown and a gentle expression that masked her exhaustion. As she served food and moved from one guest to another, she felt eyes on her, curious, prying eyes. Adiz had just arrived, dressed in an expensive jumpsuit Chioma couldn't afford even if she used 3 months' savings. Her nails were freshly done, makeup flawlessly applied, and she strutted like a peacock. But what stung most wasn't her appearance. It was the sight of the car keys Adiz casually dropped on the table. A brand new Lexus. Chioma's father raised his eyebrows and asked, "Who bought it?" Without hesitation, Adiz smiled and said, "Someone who really loves me." There was a short pause, followed by knowing glances. Ibuka, standing nearby, suddenly excused himself to the restroom. Chioma's smile did not fade, but her soul shriveled under the weight of humiliation. Every relative's gaze suddenly became heavier, as if they were now recalculating the stories they'd been told. Whispers floated through the air. "Isn't that her younger sister? That man looks too familiar in all her pictures. How come Chioma doesn't have a car?" The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore, it was public. Yet, she did not lose her composure. Instead, she walked over to the celebrant, helped her father into a chair, and said softly, "I'll pack your dinner to go, Daddy." It was the way she always responded to pain, with service, with dignity, with the kind of strength people often mistook for weakness. Inside, however, she was screaming. Not because she was jealous, but because the man she once trusted had allowed his deceit to turn her into a pitiful character in front of her own family. Later that evening, Chioma overheard her aunt whisper, "She just lets that man walk all over her. A housewife with no voice." That statement shook her deeply. It wasn't the words, it was the realization that her silence, once her strength, had started to become her label. People were no longer pitying her. They were scorning her for tolerating what they would never accept. That night, she sat alone on her friend Imaka's balcony, legs curled beneath her, hot cup of tea untouched beside her. The sky above was cloudy, yet peaceful. And in that silence she said aloud, "Let them laugh now. I'm coming." It wasn't a vow to fight. It was a quiet promise to rise, not to prove anything to her husband, her sister, or even her critics, but to reclaim herself, to become a version of Chioma that even her betrayers would no longer recognize. Ibuka had always carried pride like a badge, loud, domineering, dismissive. But that night, he outdid himself. He invited some of his business associates over for dinner, claiming it was an opportunity for Chioma to show her cooking skills. She prepared her best dishes, okra soup thick with snails, smoky jollof rice with grilled chicken, and fresh fruit salad. As the men sat at the dining table sipping red wine, Chioma served each of them with care, trying not to meet Ibuka's gaze. One of the guests complimented the meal and said, "Your wife cooks like a professional. You're a lucky man." Without missing a beat, Ibuka laughed loudly and replied, "She should be good at something, since she brings nothing else to the table." The room fell silent for a beat, then the men laughed awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke. Chioma stood frozen, the salad bowl still in her hand. She smiled faintly, walked back into the kitchen, and placed the bowl down gently. Her hands were shaking, not from anger, but shame. She had just been reduced to nothing in front of strangers by the man she once prayed for during fasting programs. It wasn't the first insult, but this one cut differently. It was calculated, public, intentional. She remained in the kitchen while they finished their meal, her ears burning with every muffled laugh, every whisper. Later that night, as she washed the dishes and Ibuka scrolled through his phone in the living room. Not once did he say thank you or acknowledge her. It was as if she didn't exist. That was the moment something snapped in her chest, not a loud shatter, but a quiet click, like a door closing forever. She didn't cry that night. She didn't confront him. She just mentally packed the last part of her love and folded it away. The next morning, Chioma told her friend Imaka she was ready to take on a large catering gig, something she had always feared she couldn't handle alone. It was a 3-day corporate retreat, and she would need to prepare food for over 100 people. Imaka warned her it would be exhausting, but Chioma was undeterred. "I need to stop shrinking myself to feed a man's ego," she said firmly. That week, she worked till her legs gave out. She cooked, delivered handled orders, and even hired a temporary assistant. The money she made from that job was more than Ibuka had ever allowed her to touch in their marriage. And with every plate she served, with every smile she earned from a satisfied client, a piece of her self-worth returned. Chioma was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was choosing herself. Every single day, Chioma's business began to take a new shape. From small food trays and church events, she quickly moved into weekend gigs, office parties, and even boutique weddings. The woman who once doubted her worth now woke at 4 a.m., tied her wrapper, and prepared meals with the precision of a military commander and the grace of a woman finally learning to love herself. It wasn't easy, nothing about it was. There were nights her fingers cramped from slicing onions, days she carried coolers in the rain, and mornings she cooked with only 2 hours of sleep. But each pain was a seed, and the harvest was beginning. One of her biggest breaks came when the wife of a commissioner tasted her food at a bridal shower and requested a private meeting. That woman would eventually refer her to multiple events, and Chioma's name quietly began to circulate among the city's elite. Meanwhile, back at home, Ibuka was growing restless. His insults became more frequent, more desperate. He mocked her when she came home late from an event. "So you're a boss lady now?" he'd scoff. "Don't forget you're still living under my roof." Chioma didn't respond. She would smile faintly, enter the bathroom, and wash her hands in silence. The more he saw her flourish, the more his grip slipped. He could feel her detaching, and that scared him. For the first time, he realized that the woman he thought couldn't survive without him was now too busy to even notice his tantrums. Adiz had become more demanding too, constantly asking for money, guilt-tripping him, threatening to expose their affair if he ever dared to stop. Ibuka was now caught in a trap of his own making, funding a mistress, who was also his wife's sister, while watching his once submissive wife turn into a woman far beyond his reach. Chioma began making quiet investments. She started a small savings group with other women vendors. She learned to price her services with confidence. And most importantly, she began to rediscover the Chioma before marriage, the dreamer, the giver, the quiet flame. One day, she looked in the mirror and saw a different woman, her skin darker from sun exposure, her arms stronger from lifting coolers, but her eyes? They were alive again. That night, she sat on her mattress and whispered, "I don't need anyone to save me. I've already started saving myself." In that moment, she didn't know what the future held. But she was sure of one thing. The Chioma that Ibuka and Adiz once betrayed no longer existed. What stood in her place was someone reborn, through fire, through pain, and through unstoppable purpose. Chioma's life had found rhythm again. Her catering business was now the heartbeat that kept her going, her therapy, her escape. But something kept gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Adiz wasn't the only one. Ibuka's attitude had changed even more. He now returned home at odd hours, his clothes often reeking of unfamiliar perfume, his phone forever locked and glued to his hand. One morning, as Chioma was cleaning the back seat of their car, preparing it for her delivery boy to help with supplies, her hand brushed against a small pack wedged between the seats. It was a box of condoms, unopened but damning. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, her mind spiraling. She and Ibuka hadn't been intimate in months, almost a year, in fact. So, who was he protecting himself with? Who else had her husband reduced himself for? Later that night, Chioma placed the box calmly on the dining table beside his plate of food. She said nothing. Ibuka paused mid-bite and looked at her. Their eyes locked in a long, icy stare. "So now you're checking my things?" he sneered. "Is this who you've become?" Chioma didn't answer. She simply stood, took her plate, and walked to the kitchen. That moment wasn't about confrontation. It was about confirmation. She now knew what she needed to know. Adiz wasn't the only betrayal. There were others. Perhaps women from his trips, women he met at clubs, maybe even someone at his office. The man she once vowed to grow old with had become unrecognizable, a ticking time bomb of infidelity and recklessness. And worst of all, he still played the victim. He acted like her silence was aggression, like her strength was arrogance, like her growth threatened him. But Chioma had stopped needing answers. She didn't need to know who, where, or why. She had reached a point where his sins no longer shocked her. They merely clarified her path. That night, she prayed not for her marriage to be healed, but for her heart to let go of the illusion that there was anything left to heal. She cried, yes, but not for him. She wept for the version of herself that waited years for love in a place it would never live. She wept for the dreams she once had of raising a family in a home filled with laughter. She wept for the love she gave that was never returned. And when the tears dried, she felt lighter, like grief had made room for something else. Not happiness yet, but strength. And that was enough for now. It was a rainy Tuesday night when everything finally came crashing down. Ibuka had returned home late again, this time clearly drunk. His shirt was unbuttoned, his belt half loose, and his eyes bloodshot. He slumped on the couch, kicked off his shoes, and began complaining loudly that there was no food ready. Chioma calmly brought out the tray she had kept warm for hours. "I didn't know if you'd come back," she said softly. He glanced at the plate and hissed, "This is what you call dinner? Is this how you treat a man who pays your bills?" That statement struck a nerve. After everything, after sponsoring her sister behind her back, after multiple affairs, after countless emotional wounds, he still saw himself as her savior. Something inside Chioma finally broke. She took a deep breath and sat across from him, staring him straight in the eyes. "Ibuka, what did I ever do to deserve this kind of hate?" she asked, voice trembling but firm. "I loved you. I trusted you. I gave you my youth, my womb, my faith. And all you've ever done is punish me for not being perfect." He laughed bitterly. "Adiz is better than you in every way. She's exciting. She knows how to make a man feel alive. You're boring, always trying to play Mother Teresa." The words cut through her like a blade, but they were also liberating. He had said it, out loud. The truth had stepped into the light, and it burned. Chioma stood up, walked into their bedroom, and began packing. No screaming, no second thoughts, only finality. By the time morning came, she was gone. She had packed just 2 boxes, the essentials. Her clothes, her documents, and a framed photo of her late mother. She left the wedding ring on the dresser, a note beside it that simply read, "I will not die here." She didn't go to her parents' house. She didn't want the pity. Instead, she called Amaka, who welcomed her with open arms and a mattress on the floor. For the first time in years, Chioma breathed freely. Her body ached. Her heart throbbed. But her soul, it felt alive. She looked around the small room, the faded curtains, the tiny ceiling fan rattling above her. And she whispered, "Thank you, God. I may have left with nothing, but I finally have myself back." That day, Chioma didn't mourn a broken marriage. She celebrated her escape from a slow, emotional death. Living at Amaka's wasn't glamorous. The space was cramped, and they shared a bathroom with 2 other tenants. Every morning, Chioma folded her mattress, tied her wrapper, and went straight to the kitchen to help with meals and orders. At night, she lay on the floor with her thoughts as her only company. But strangely, she was more at peace than she had ever been in her husband's mansion. There were no footsteps she had to fear, no sneers to dodge, no empty silences to fill. Just the quiet hum of healing. Amaka refused to let her sink into despair. "I know you want to stay quiet, Chi," she said one day, handing her a bowl of EBA, but you've got to talk. Even if it's just to God. And slowly, Chioma began to talk. Not about Ibuka, not about Adiz, but about herself, who she was, who she wanted to be. Business continued to bloom. Word had spread about her food at the commissioner's event. She received calls for more jobs, parties, naming ceremonies, even small weddings. She invested in a new portable gas cooker, got better packaging materials, and began writing down her recipes. Amaka helped her draft a price list. For the first time, Chioma started to feel like a real businesswoman. She even created a social media page, modest but elegant, where she posted pictures of her dishes, sometimes with handwritten notes like prepared with grace or healing on a plate. She didn't post her face, not yet. But her brand began to shine. People didn't know her story. They only tasted her strength through her food. And in every pot of soup, every tray of rice, she poured the pain she had lived through, transforming it into flavor and hope. Ibuka didn't call, not once, but she heard from others. He was still with Adiz, still funding her lifestyle, still pretending like nothing had happened. Her name was slowly fading from their lips, like she never existed. And that was okay, because Chioma wasn't looking back anymore. She was learning to look forward, even when it hurt. On the nights when the loneliness crept in, she'd place a hand on her chest and whisper, "You are enough." And every morning, she reminded herself, "You are building something better." She didn't know what the future held. She had no grand plan. But she had finally done the hardest thing. She had chosen herself. And that choice, she would soon learn, was the beginning of everything. The news broke like thunder on a quiet afternoon. Chioma had just finished serving lunch at a corporate event when she received a call from her younger cousin Ifunanya. "Chioma, have you heard?" Her voice trembled. Adiz collapsed in a salon. They rushed her to the hospital. The doctors say it might be serious. Chioma froze. Not from worry, but from a sudden, strange weight she couldn't explain. She hadn't seen or spoken to Adiz in months, not since leaving Ibuka's house. The betrayal was still raw, but she had made peace with the silence. Now her heart raced, not from love, not even anger, but from a distant knowing that something was shifting. She thanked Ifunanya and went back to work, her hand steady, but her spirit shaken. She didn't know why, but something told her the facade her sister built was about to fall apart. Later that evening, she received another call, this time from a mutual friend who worked at the hospital. "Chioma, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but Adiz tested positive. HIV. Advanced stage." She had been ignoring symptoms for a long time. The words echoed in her ears like a bomb. She sat still, eyes wide, her breath shallow. "And Chioma," the friend added, "Ibuka came in for testing too. He's positive." The floor beneath her felt like it disappeared. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. It wasn't shock. It was the bitter confirmation that everything they built on deception had finally come crashing down. The man who mocked her, who called her boring, who starved her of affection while running from woman to woman, was now sick. And Adiz, the same sister who had laughed behind her back, was falling apart too. But strangely, Chioma didn't feel triumphant. She felt hollow. She paced the room for hours, thoughts swirling. Her heart battled with conflicting emotions, pity, anger, fear, even guilt. Then slowly, the realization dawned. She needed to get tested too. She had been neglected sexually for nearly a year, but the years before hadn't been so. The fear gripped her so tightly that night she couldn't sleep. She prayed in silence, knees on the cold floor, hands pressed against her chest. "God, I walk through fire, but please don't let this be the wound that finishes me." Her mind flashed back to moments when she felt unwanted, when she had begged for intimacy and been rejected. And now, that rejection might have been her salvation. Still, she was terrified, not just for her health, but for what she would become if her body bore the cost of another person's betrayal. She decided to go to the clinic the next morning, alone, prepared for anything, but praying for mercy. The clinic was quiet that morning. A soft gospel song played in the waiting room, the lyrics almost painful in their relevance. "He'll never let you fall. Chioma sat with her hands folded, legs pressed together tightly, her mind numb. The nurse called her in, drew her blood, and offered a comforting smile. "Results will be ready in a few hours," she said. Chioma nodded, unable to speak. She walked to a nearby park and sat under a mango tree, watching mothers play with their children, joggers run past, couples walk hand in hand. She felt disconnected from the world, like her life was paused while the rest of it moved on. Her thoughts returned to Ibuka, not with longing, but with sorrow. How a man so full of pride could fall so far. How a sister who once braided her hair and called her Shishi could become a shadow of her own greed. But most painfully, how she, Chioma, had been the only one punished for trying to love with her whole heart. By afternoon, she returned to the clinic, heart pounding. The nurse motioned her in and sat her down. "Chioma, your results are negative." For a second, she didn't understand. "You mean?" "I'm not." The nurse smiled gently. "You're not infected. You're healthy." Chioma broke. She didn't cry loudly. She simply collapsed into a heap of grateful tears. The nurse patted her shoulder, whispering, "You're lucky. Many aren't this fortunate." Chioma couldn't explain the feeling. It was like being given a second life, like God had seen her suffering and said no more. All the humiliation, the starvation, the silence, it had shielded her. Ibuka's cruelty, Adi's selfishness, what they meant for pain, had unknowingly become her protection. She was spared not just physically, but emotionally, because now she could walk forward without being tethered to their consequences. That night, she held herself tightly on her small mattress, rocking slowly. She whispered, "Thank you, God," again and again, until the words became sobs. She cried not just from relief, but from the realization that this pain had a purpose. Her rejection had preserved her, her loneliness had insulated her, and her silence had saved her life. She no longer needed revenge. Their own hands had carved their downfall. All she had to do now was rise, not out of bitterness, but out of gratitude, out of survival, out of strength. From that day forward, Chioma began to live as if each day was her reward, not just for enduring betrayal, but for surviving it untouched. It wasn't long before Ibuka came crawling back. Word had spread through family and friends about his condition, and though Chioma remained quiet, the silence made him desperate. He showed up at Amaka's doorstep one evening, thinner, paler, with eyes that had lost their arrogance. He held a bag of fruit and a half-wilted bouquet. Amaka stood in the doorway, arms folded. "She doesn't want to see you," she said. But Chioma emerged quietly behind her. She wasn't afraid. She looked at him, really looked at him, and all she saw was a man reaping what he had sown. "Chioma, please," he began, voice raspy. "We can survive this together. Let's fix it. I've made mistakes." His voice cracked. "I need you." But his words fell like ash. She stepped forward, her face calm, eyes steady. "You need me now that you have nothing. But when I needed you, you humiliated me." He tried to touch her hand, but she pulled back. "You lied, you cheated, and you mocked me to my face. And now you want me to carry your burden after you've broken me." Her voice remained soft, but her tone was unshakable. "I'm not angry anymore, Ibuka. I'm just done. And that's worse than hate." His shoulders dropped as the last spark of hope flickered out of his eyes. "But I'm sick, Chioma," he said. "You're the only one who ever truly loved me." She nodded. "And you crushed that love like it meant nothing." A silence stretched between them, thick with regret. Amaka stepped in. "You've said your piece. Now leave." Ibuka turned slowly and walked away, the weight of his sickness visible in every step. Chioma didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. That chapter had closed long before his body began to fail. Back inside, Chioma sat down and exhaled deeply. For the first time, she felt nothing toward Ibuka. No rage, no longing, just peace. The peace of someone who had been set free. Amaka hugged her tightly. "You did well," she whispered. Chioma nodded, eyes closed. She was no longer the woman who begged for affection, who cried in silence, who questioned her worth. She had survived. and she had done so with her dignity intact. Whatever happened next, whether love ever came again or not, she knew she would be fine. Because she had walked through betrayal and hadn't come out bitter. She had stood before her past and didn't kneel. That, more than anything, was her victory. The day began like any other. Chioma was at a private event, serving steaming jollof rice to a room of corporate executives, when she suddenly felt her vision blur. A wave of nausea hit her, followed by a sharp dizziness that made the tray tremble in her hands. Her assistant rushed to her side as she collapsed gently onto a chair. A concerned guest offered her water, but the spinning wouldn't stop. They rushed her to a nearby clinic where she lay on a cold examination bed, heart racing with fear. She had barely eaten that morning, and the stress of running her business with minimal rest had taken its toll. But even in that moment, she felt something deeper, an unfamiliar flutter in her abdomen that wasn't hunger or illness. It felt new, alive. When the nurse returned with her results, Chioma braced herself for bad news. The nurse smiled softly, holding her hand. "You're not sick, Chioma, you're pregnant." For a moment, Chioma blinked in disbelief. "Pregnant?" she echoed, almost like it was a word she hadn't spoken in years. The nurse nodded. "About 2 months. Your blood pressure is low, but your baby is fine." Time froze. Chioma's hand moved to her belly, and an involuntary tear slipped down her cheek. Her mind raced. How? She hadn't been with Ibuka in nearly a year. But then she remembered, one evening, during one of his brief moments of forced intimacy before the silence took over. A night she had buried deep, chalked up as one of many wounds. But that night had planted a seed. And now, from the ashes of heartbreak, life was stirring inside her. As she walked out of the clinic, Chioma's steps were slower. The weight of the news pressed heavily on her shoulders, not in fear, but in awe. Her body, once mocked and rejected, was now carrying the one thing Ibuka had accused her of being incapable of giving, a child. It wasn't just a pregnancy. It was poetic justice. It was restoration. But it also brought new fears. What would Ibuka say? Would he claim the child? Would Adiz return with more poison in her words? Chioma placed her hand gently over her belly and whispered, "I will protect you. Even if it's just me, I will protect you." She didn't know how to raise a child alone, but she knew what it meant to love unconditionally. And this baby, born in betrayal but wrapped in grace, would never feel unwanted. News travels faster than secrets can hide. Within 2 weeks of Chioma confirming her pregnancy, Ibuka somehow found out. He arrived again at Amaka's apartment unannounced, this time not with flowers, but with entitlement in his voice. "I heard you're pregnant," he said, standing in the doorway, eyes sharper now, ego rekindled. "That's my child." The audacity stunned Chioma. This was the same man who rejected her love, poisoned her self-esteem, and only resurfaced when he had nothing left. Now he wanted to plant himself in a narrative she had built without him. "You lost the right to call anything mine the day you destroyed me," she replied. But Ibuka wasn't backing down. "You can't keep my child from me. You think because you're hurt, you can erase me." Chioma stood tall, belly barely showing, heart brimming with resolve. "No, I'm not erasing you. You erased yourself the day you chose Adiz over your vows." What Chioma didn't know was that Adiz had also found out, and unlike Ibuka, her reaction wasn't possessiveness, but venom. She posted cryptic messages on social media, calling Chioma a snake and homewrecker, spinning tales to mutual friends, and even suggesting that Chioma seduced Ibuka to trap him with a baby. The betrayal multiplied in layers. Not only was she dealing with a former husband's toxic reappearance, but also the sister who had betrayed her, painting herself as a victim. People began whispering again. Some even said Chioma was trying to win him back with a baby. The worst part was watching her own name become the center of gossip, again, for something that was a miracle. She had kept quiet through pain. Now she was being judged through joy. Through it all, Chioma did not speak publicly. She didn't defend herself in the group chats or call family meetings. She protected her peace like a sacred altar. When a neighbor asked about the rumors, she simply smiled and said, "God knows the truth." She began attending prenatal checkups, taking her vitamins, and eating better. She enrolled in an online course for food entrepreneurs and turned her business into a registered brand. For every lie they spread, she planted something real. Her baby was her anchor, her reason to stay focused. One night, as she lay on her bed, hand resting on her growing belly, she whispered, "You are the most beautiful thing they never expected. You are not proof of my pain, you are proof of my survival." And in that moment, she realized that her child wasn't just a blessing. The baby was her final closure, the chapter that made her story whole. The annual Lagos Women in Food Expo was not a place Chioma had ever imagined herself standing, let alone displaying her work. But there she was, her food stall, Chioma's Grace Kitchen, glowing with elegance and aroma. Dressed in a soft blue gown that hugged her slowly growing bump, she radiated calm strength. Her jollof rice and peppered chicken drew long queues, and people complimented not just the taste, but the packaging, the service, the warmth in her eyes. In that space, she was no longer Ibuka's ex or a D's sister. She was Chioma, the woman who had rebuilt her life from betrayal. And that was when she met Chinedu. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. Just a man in his late 30s with kind eyes and a quiet confidence. He tried her food, complimented her flavoring, and asked, "Did you learn this from your mother?" She smiled softly. "No, I learned it through heartbreak." Chinedu was a widower. His wife had passed 3 years ago, and he had been raising their daughter alone. There was a gentleness in his voice, a patience that disarmed her. Over the next few weeks, they kept in touch, talking about food, business, parenting, and life. Unlike Ibuka, Chinedu never interrupted her thoughts or tried to finish her sentences. He listened, truly listened. And when he found out she was pregnant, he didn't flinch. "That child is lucky to have a mother like you," he said, eyes soft with sincerity. Chioma didn't rush into anything. She had been burned before. But something about Chinedu made her believe that healing wasn't just a solo journey. It could also come from being seen, truly seen, by someone who valued her for who she was, not who she used to be. With Chinedu's encouragement, she expanded her business online, started mentoring younger caterers, and even began saving for a small restaurant space. Her belly grew, her joy deepened, and her spirit finally rested. Adiz had gone silent. Ibuka stopped calling. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment, it felt like freedom. One evening, as she sat on Chinedu's porch, his daughter sleeping inside, her hands gently resting on her belly, he looked at her and said, "Chioma, you are the strongest woman I've ever met. And I don't want to walk away from that strength." She looked at him, heart swelling, not with butterflies, but with peace. That kind of peace that doesn't knock loudly, but seeps into your bones. And in that moment, she realized that the story of her pain was never the end. It was just the path to something she never believed she still deserved, joy. Ibuka was no longer the man people used to envy. His weight had dropped visibly, his once vibrant eyes now dulled with fatigue and regret. He had begun to withdraw from public life, as whispers of his health spread beyond whispers into undeniable truth. The other women he'd once flaunted disappeared like smoke when the fire turned inward. Adiz, now burdened by her own failing health and financial ruin, had turned bitter and isolated. The once glamorous sister, who paraded around in luxury, now lived off favors and medications. Her skin pale, her eyes hollow. Chioma hadn't seen either of them in over 6 months, but she heard just enough from distant family to know their kingdom of deceit had finally crumbled. And yet she carried no joy in their fall, only a strange stillness, like watching the end of a storm from a distance. Then, one quiet morning, Chioma received a call. Ibuka was bedridden, barely responsive, and had requested to see her. She paused for a long time before responding. This wasn't a man she loved anymore. It wasn't even about closure. But something in her heart nudged her to go. Not for him, for herself. When she arrived, the house felt like a tomb, quiet, cold, filled with the ghosts of what once was. Ibuka was lying in bed, his face gaunt, his frame weak. His eyes lit up faintly when he saw her. Chioma, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You look strong. She said nothing, just nodded and sat beside him. I destroyed everything, didn't I? He asked, a single tear rolling down his cheek. I thought I had time. I thought Adiz loved me. I thought I was untouchable. Chioma looked at him. This man who once made her feel small, made her beg for love, made her question her own worth, and all she felt now was distance. Not hatred, not vengeance, just distance, like standing at the edge of a grave you'll never cry over. You didn't destroy everything, she said gently. You only revealed who you were. He sobbed quietly, a man who had nothing left to offer, not apology, not redemption, just regret. Chioma stood slowly, her belly now heavy with life. She looked at him one last time and said, You gave me pain, yes, but that pain gave me strength. And now I have something you can never take from me again, peace. She left the room without looking back. And for the first time since she met Ibuka, she didn't feel like a broken woman walking away. She felt like a warrior who had won. Years passed, and the air no longer carried the taste of sorrow for Chioma. She stood in her restaurant, Grace and Flame, now a modest but thriving space on the edge of town. The walls were painted in warm yellow and cream, with framed quotes and food photos surrounding guests in hope and hospitality. Her son, now a playful toddler, danced around the kitchen with a toy spatula, giggling as her staff laughed along. Chioma looked at him with wonder, the child born from heartbreak, who had become her anchor, her joy, her reason. Every day he grew stronger. She healed a little more. And every time she heard him call her mama, she remembered how life had tried to bury her, but she had bloomed anyway. Chinedu was now more than just a friend. He was a gentle, steadfast partner who had proposed not with flashy rings or a grand audience, but in their quiet kitchen after dinner, kneeling beside her son and asking, Can we be a family now? Chioma cried, tears not from pain, but from finally being seen without being used. Their marriage months later was simple, intimate, and sacred. Her son walked down the aisle with her, clutching her hand like a torchbearer of everything she had survived. Friends and family clapped not because it was a lavish wedding, but because it was proof of her victory, proof that dignity, when protected, could rewrite any narrative. As the sun set one evening, Chioma sat on the porch of their new home with Chinedu beside her and her son asleep in her lap. The sky blazed orange, like fire tamed into beauty. She held her husband's hand and whispered, I thought betrayal would be the last thing I'd ever feel, but now it's love. He looked at her, kissed her hand, and said, That's because you never let pain define you. You let it refine you. And in that quiet moment, with no noise, no audience, no applause, Chioma felt it, the healing. Not from time, not from others, but from her own choice to rise. Ibuka's name was now a whisper she no longer heard. Adiz's absence, a silence she no longer feared. She had built something stronger than revenge. She had built a legacy. And in the echo of her journey, she had become more than a woman who survived betrayal. She had become a woman who turned ashes into light and never looked back. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.